The air inside Elias Thorne's sprawling smart home was colder than it needed to be. A sterile chill that bit at my exposed skin even through the layers of my examination suit. January in the city was already unforgiving, but this was different. An artificial frost that permeated the very silence of the place. I ran a gloved hand over the sleek, matte black wall panel, feeling the faint hum of unseen machinery beneath. The residence was a fortress, a monument to a reclusive tech mogul's paranoia and his boundless wealth. Every door, every window, every vent was sealed by layers of biometric and digital security. Getting in had been a bureaucratic nightmare, even for the responding officers. Getting out, it seemed, had been impossible for Thorne. Clear suicide, Reed. The lead detective, a burly man whose patience wore thinner than a surgical glove, stated without looking up from his tablet. He stood near the entrance to what I knew from the initial briefing was Thorne's personal data core. Locked from the inside, no forced entry, no signs of struggle. The notes explicit, open and shut. I offered no reply, merely adjusted the fit of my respirator. My job wasn't to confirm, it was to uncover. The room pulsed with the low thrum of power, a symphony of white noise punctuated by the rhythmic flicker of hundreds of indicator lights. Green, amber, red, a silent conversation between machines. My gaze swept across the scene. The body was positioned almost artfully, one arm extended, the other bent at an unnatural angle. A high-frequency sonic emitter, a device Thorne had supposedly invented for data destruction, lay near his outstretched hand. The initial report claimed he had turned it on himself, the concentrated sound waves rupturing internal organs. A grim, technologically advanced way to go. Server racks stretched from floor to ceiling, their metal skins gleaming under the recessed lighting. Cables, meticulously bundled and routed, snaked along the raised floor. Every component seemed to be exactly where it should be, every surface immaculately clean. Too clean, perhaps. I knelt, my knees protesting against the hard floor. I ignored the detective's impatient sighs, focusing on the details. Thorne's eyes were open, fixed on a point far beyond the ceiling, his pupils dilated. No rigor mortis had fully set in, suggesting he hadn't been dead for more than a few hours. I noted the faint blue discoloration of lividity on his back, consistent with the position he was found in. My eyes moved from the body to the immediate surroundings. The sonic emitter device was heavy, solid, its casing cool beneath my gloved fingers. No smudges, no obvious signs of tampering. It was almost pristine. I mentally cataloged the precise angle of his head, the way his fingers curled, the slight stiffness of his expensive suit jacket. Everything screamed textbook suicide. And that was precisely what bothered me. I moved closer to the server racks, my gaze tracing the lines of blinking lights. Each one a tiny vault of digital fortune. It wasn't moisture, nor dust. It was more like an oily residue, a faint, iridescent smudge that caught the light only when I angled my head just so. It was minuscule, the kind of detail most people would dismiss as a trick of the light, or perhaps a residual fingerprint from Thorne himself. This one, however, had a distinct, almost ethereal shimmer. And it wasn't positioned in a way that Thorne, in his final moments, would have naturally touched it. It was slightly recessed, tucked away, almost hidden. My mind raced. And if he had, why was the smudge so faint, so delicate? It didn't look like the robust imprint of a struggling man. It looked like a fleeting touch, almost a caress. I straightened up slowly, my internal alarm bells ringing. The detective grunted, finally tearing his attention from his tablet. "Find something, Reed?" His tone was laced with thinly veiled impatience. I turned to him, my gaze unwavering. "This isn't as straightforward as it looks," I stated, my voice low, cutting through the hum of the servers. "The scene is too perfect. This doesn't sit right with me," he scoffed. A billionaire, locked in his vault, with a suicide note and a self-inflicted wound from his own tech. What else could it be, Kincaid? An invisible assassin? Perhaps, I said, meeting his gaze directly. This wasn't just a death. It was a carefully constructed narrative, designed to be read one way. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that Elias Thorne hadn't taken his own life. He had been murdered, and the killer was playing a very sophisticated game. Perhaps, I had said, meeting the detective's gaze directly. Or one who understands forensic science as well as he understands his own systems. A chill, far colder than the data center air, had settled in my gut. And that narrative felt profoundly false. The scent of antiseptic and stale coffee clung to the examination room like a shroud. Fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sterile, unforgiving glare on the stainless steel table. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the material stretching taut over my fingers. The body of Thorne, the tech mogul, lay before me, draped in a white sheet. His face, even in death, held a trace of the sharp intellect that had built his empire. The official report from the initial responders echoed the detective's conviction. Suicide by a fall from a considerable height within his smart home. An open and shut case, they'd called it. I knew better than to trust the obvious. My scalpel felt like an extension of my will, a precise instrument for peeling back layers of deception. I began my external examination, my eyes scanning every inch of skin, every nail bed, every hair follicle. The superficial abrasions and contusions were consistent with a fall, yes, but my gaze lingered on the fingertips. Under the magnified lens, I detected a faint, almost imperceptible residue. It wasn't dust or skin cells or anything organic. It shimmered with a subtle metallic sheen. I carefully collected samples using specialized swabs, sealing them in sterile vials for later analysis. My mind immediately went back to the data center aisle-cold wallets and blinking servers, the precise, almost surgical environment Thorne had created. Could this residue be from something within that digital fortress? I proceeded with the internal examination, the methodical process of familiar ritual. The internal injuries were substantial, confirming the impact of a fall. Rib fractures, organ contusions, textbook trauma. But as I meticulously dissected the cervical spine, searching for any anomalies, my fingers brushed against something subtly wrong. I paused, repositioning the neck, angling the light. There, nestled against the C3 vertebra, was a hairline fracture. It was tiny, almost invisible, a spiderweb crack in the bone. It wasn't a clean break, nor did it appear to be a secondary injury from the terminal fall. This fracture was older, its edges showing early signs of cellular repair, a faint callus forming. More critically, its orientation suggested a rotational force, a sudden twist, rather than the compressive force expected from a head-first impact. This was a pre-existing injury, sustained hours, perhaps even a full day before the fatal plunge. A man doesn't accidentally acquire a rotational microfracture in his neck, then spontaneously decide to jump. This wasn't a suicide. This was a carefully orchestrated performance, designed to mimic one. I finished the examination, documenting every finding with meticulous precision, taking dozens of photographs. When I finally peeled off my gloves, my hands felt heavy, not from the physical labor, but from the weight of what I'd uncovered. Later that afternoon, the precinct meeting room felt as sterile and unwelcoming as my examination slab. Detective Miller, a man whose patience often ran thinner than a razor blade, sat across from me, arms crossed. A few other colleagues from the investigative unit were present, their faces etched with the expectation of a quick closure. "So, Reed," Miller began, his voice flat, "anything change our initial assessment?" I laid out my findings, projecting the magnified images onto the screen. The external injuries are consistent with a fall, yes. However, I found a unique polymer residue on the victim's fingertips. It's not something commonly found in a residential setting, and it certainly wasn't on the railing from which he supposedly fell. I clicked to the next slide, showing the hairline fracture. More significantly, This microfracture in the C3 vertebra. It's consistent with a sudden, forceful rotational twist to the neck. And crucially, it shows early signs of healing, indicating it occurred at least 12 to 24 hours before death, not during the fall itself. A silence descended, thick and uncomfortable. Miller leaned forward, his brow furrowed. A pre-existing fracture? Reed, people have old injuries. And a trace element? Could be anything. Static electricity, something from his tech lab, a new gadget he was handling. The fracture's orientation is key, I countered, my voice firm. It's inconsistent with the terminal trauma, and the residue, I believe, will be highly specific once analyzed. My hypothesis is that Thorne was incapacitated, perhaps even killed before the fall. The fall was staged to cover the true cause of death. Miller sighed, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. He was alone. The smart home logs confirm that. Everything points to a suicide. You're asking us to believe someone broke in, inflicted a specific non-fatal injury, then waited a day, then somehow got him to fall from a great height in a way that perfectly mimicked suicide, all without a single witness or electronic footprint? I'm asking you to consider that the killer is exceptionally clever, I replied, my gaze unwavering. Clever enough to leave a trail that looks like suicide. Clever enough to understand how to manipulate the scene, and perhaps even the smart home's logs. This isn't an open and shut case, detective. It's a meticulously crafted deception, and I intend to unravel it. The skepticism in the room was palpable, a wall of resistance. But the subtle inconsistencies I'd found were too loud to ignore. The truth, I knew, was hidden in the details, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. And I was nothing if not patient. The skepticism I'd faced was a familiar adversary, a dense fog that obscured the truth. But I'd learned long ago that the most profound insights often emerged from the most unlikely places, especially when the prevailing narrative felt too neat. Thorne's case, initially dismissed as a tragic, if mundane end, gnawed at me. The subtle inconsistencies I'd found weren't whispers. They were shouts in a silent room. My path forward was clear. If the physical evidence was being overlooked, I needed to dig into the digital. I sought out the lead cyberforensics expert, a man known for his meticulous, if sometimes rigid, approach. His office, a stark contrast to my own organized chaos, was a monument to order, every monitor displaying lines of code, every cable meticulously tied. He looked up, his expression unreadable, as I explained my need to revisit Thorne's smart home system data. "Reed," the expert said, his voice flat. "We've already run the diagnostics. Clean. It's all in the report." "I understand the initial findings," I countered, leaning forward, my voice low but firm. "But I found anomalies in the physical environment that suggest a more complex scenario. The position of the body, the specific contusions, the peculiar state of the environmental controls. They don't align with a simple, self-inflicted act. I need to look deeper into the system logs, specifically around the time of death. Not just for breaches, but for unauthorized activity that might have been disguised." He sighed, a barely perceptible exhalation that still managed to convey his annoyance. "Disguised activity is harder to find than a needle in a hayfield, Reed, especially with a system as robust as Thorne's. He built it to be impenetrable. And that's precisely why someone who did penetrate it would be exceptionally good at covering their tracks," I pressed. "I'm not asking you to redo your entire investigation, just to dedicate some time, with me present, to a more granular examination of specific timeframes and device interactions. Look for what isn't there, or what's been made to look like something else." After a tense moment, he nodded, a reluctant concession. "All right, Reed, but don't expect miracles. We're already stretched thin." He led me through a maze of corridors, the air growing colder with each turn, until we arrived at a secure facility. The heavy door hissed open, revealing a vast humming space. This was the nerve center, where the digital ghosts of cases past and present resided. We walked deeper into the heart of the operation, past rows of blinking lights and silent, towering machines. The air was dry, charged with electricity, and smelled faintly of ozone. He directed me to a workstation, already prepped with Thorne's system image. On the main monitor, a complex network diagram glowed, representing Thorne's sprawling smart home. Every sensor, every camera, every automated function was mapped out. I pointed to the estimated time of death, a precise window I'd narrowed down during my initial examination. "Start here," I instructed, my gaze fixed on the screen. "Focus on the environmental controls: temperature, humidity, air quality. Then the security protocols. Look for any commands that don't originate from Thorne's authorized devices, or that are immediately overwritten." The cyber forensics expert began typing, his fingers flying across the keyboard, commands scrolling rapidly. Hours blurred into a monotonous rhythm of searching, filtering, and cross-referencing. The initial logs were pristine, as he'd initially claimed. Thorne's system appeared to have functioned flawlessly, a testament to his engineering prowess. Had I been wrong? Was my intuition leading me down a blind alley? Then, the expert paused. His posture stiffened. "Wait a minute," he murmured, leaning closer to the screen. My eyes snapped to the display. He had isolated a series of microtransactions within the climate control system, so brief they were almost imperceptible. They appeared as routine system adjustments, a fractional degree change, a momentary spike in fan speed. But something felt off. These aren't typical," he replied, zooming in further. "They're too precise, too uniform for random environmental fluctuations, and they're almost immediately countermanded by Thorne's usual programming. It's like a ghost in the machine, a brief phantom system override that corrects itself before it can register as an anomaly." My mind raced. A phantom override. Can you trace the origin point of those micro-commands? He worked furiously, his initial reluctance replaced by a focused intensity. But then, he found something else. "Look here," he said, pointing to another section of the logs, buried deep within what appeared to be routine system maintenance files. "These aren't deleted logs, Reed. They're disguised logs. It wasn't just a phantom override. It was a sophisticated remote access point, active for a mere 73 seconds during my estimated time of death. The access wasn't a brute force attack. It was a surgical insertion, leveraging an unknown vulnerability, and then meticulously erased, leaving behind only these cleverly disguised fragments. The system hadn't been breached. It had been commanded. My breath hitched. This wasn't a suicide. This wasn't even a simple murder. This was a meticulously planned assassination, executed with a level of technological expertise that mirrored Thorne's own genius. The killer hadn't just murdered him. They had meticulously scrubbed the digital scene, knowing precisely what to look for and how to hide it. The cyber forensics expert leaned back, his face pale. "This changes everything, Reed. Someone didn't just break in. The subtle inconsistencies, the inexplicable details, the impossible scenario. It all clicked into place. The skepticism in the room might have been a wall of resistance, but this discovery was a wrecking ball. The truth, hidden in the digital details, was no longer waiting. It was screaming. And it implicated a killer far more cunning and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The truth, hidden in the digital details, was no longer a whisper. It was a blaring alarm. The lead detective, a man whose face usually wore a mask of weary certainty, had watched my demonstration with a growing unease. I had laid out the timeline of the home's systems, the phantom commands, the expertly scrubbed logs that paradoxically screamed their own presence. The smart home hadn't been locked from the inside by Thorne. It had been sealed from the outside, a digital tomb constructed around a man already dead. "So, not a suicide," the detective stated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, his gaze fixed on the holographic display still hovering above the console. The ghost of Thorne's last moments, manipulated and false, shimmered there. Not even close, I confirmed, my voice steady despite the tremor of adrenaline that still ran through me. This was a murder, detective. The initial skepticism, the quiet dismissiveness, evaporated, replaced by a grim determination. My findings had ripped open an open and shut case, exposing a chilling, calculating mind at work. The detective nodded slowly, his eyes now alight with a hunter's focus. All right, Kincaid, Thorne's life. We need to dissect it. And so, we did. The investigation broadened, sprawling beyond the confines of the sealed smart home. Thorne's empire, built on algorithms and audacious investments, became our new crime scene. Financial records, communication logs, past litigation. Every piece of his complex existence was pulled into the harsh light of scrutiny. The picture that emerged was not of a universally beloved innovator, but of a man who had made his fortune by stepping on toes, crushing competitors, and leaving a trail of disgruntled former partners in his wake. We uncovered a dizzying array of potential motives. There was the rival tech titan whose company Thorne had aggressively acquired, leaving the titan publicly humiliated and financially devastated. There was an estranged business associate, once Thorne's closest confidant, who had lost a fortune when Thorne abruptly changed investment strategies, leaving the associate in ruin. Each individual, a fresh thread in a tangled web, offered a compelling reason for wanting Thorne gone. The interviews began. I sat beside the detective, my role shifting from forensic analysis to behavioral observation, listening to the carefully constructed alibis, searching for the telltale signs of deception. The first was the rival tech titan, a man with a perpetually clenched jaw and eyes that darted like trapped birds. He spoke of his deep respect for Thorne, his voice a brittle facade over a simmering resentment. His alibi was solid. A transcontinental flight during the exact window of Thorne's death, confirmed by flight manifests and airport security footage. Yet the bitterness radiating from him was a palpable force. Next, the estranged business associate. He claimed to be in a remote mountain cabin, off-grid, seeking solace. No witnesses, no digital footprint. A convenient alibi, almost too perfect. Yet he lacked the technical sophistication I believed our killer possessed. He barely knew how to operate his own smartphone, let alone hack a secure smart home. I watched him closely, but his grief, however self-inflicted, seemed genuine. We moved through a procession of faces. A disgruntled former employee, dismissed under contentious circumstances. A jilted investor who felt cheated out of a lucrative deal. A former personal assistant who had access to Thorne's daily routines. Each one had a reason, a simmering grievance, but none of them, when pressed, could demonstrate the kind of technical prowess or foresight required for such an elaborate digital murder. Their alibis, while sometimes flimsy, rarely pointed to a direct opportunity, let alone the specialized knowledge needed. The frustration began to mount, a dull ache behind my eyes. Motives were plentiful, but capabilities and opportunities remained elusive. It was like sifting through sand for a specific grain, knowing it was there but unable to grasp it. The killer had not only covered their tracks, but had created a digital smokescreen so elaborate it made every potential suspect look either too obvious or entirely incapable. I found myself drawn back to the digital infrastructure, the true heart of Thorne's operation. Late one evening, after another fruitless interview, I requested access to a specific facility, one I knew Thorne had heavily invested in. The detective, seeing the urgency in my eyes, reluctantly agreed. Rows upon rows of towering racks hummed with a low, insistent thrum. Indicator lights, a million tiny pulses of green and amber, flickered in rhythmic unison, illuminating the narrow corridors like an alien landscape. This was where Thorne's digital empire truly resided, a fortress of data and processing power. My fingers brushed against the cool metal of a server rack, a physical connection to the ethereal world of code and information. This was where the killer had truly operated, not with a weapon of steel, but with a weapon of pure intellect, manipulating the very fabric of Thorne's digital existence. Thorne's financial dealings, his legal skirmishes, the endless digital paper trail of his empire, all of it was crucial, I knew, but my mind kept circling back to the locked room. To the how. How had the killer entered? How had they exited? The answers to those questions still felt tethered to the smart home itself, a technological fortress that had supposedly failed its master. "We need to break in," I told the lead forensic technologist, a sharp woman with an unnervingly calm demeanor, as we stood outside Thorne's imposing residence. The sun, already high, glinted off the reinforced glass panels. Every possible way, physical, digital, we need to find the crack. The technologist nodded, her expression unreadable. She'd assembled a team, a mix of digital forensic specialists and old-school lockpickers, all of them veterans of breaching secure systems. For the next 2 days, Thorne's smart home became our proving ground, a high-stakes, real-world puzzle. Our recreation began with the obvious. The perimeter, a mesh of laser grids and motion sensors, was the first hurdle. The team's entry specialists, nimble and precise, attempted to bypass the sensors using various methods: infrared blockers, acoustic dampeners, even a simple, carefully placed blanket. Each attempt was met with the silent, unwavering resistance of the system. We watched the feeds from the internal cameras, still active, still recording, as the house remained utterly undisturbed. No alarms, no alerts. Just the silent, watchful eye of Thorne's bespoke security. Next came the physical entry points. The reinforced doors, designed to withstand a battering ram, were scrutinized. Lockpicks, thermal lances, even a miniature hydraulic spreader were brought to bear. The lead lockpicker, a man who could usually coax open any tumbler, worked with a focused intensity, his brow furrowed. After an hour, he straightened, shaking his head. "These aren't off the shelf. Custom alloy, multi-point engagement. And the internal bracing? It's a vault, Reed." The windows, equally robust, proved just as impenetrable. Layered, bullet-resistant glass sealed with an advanced polymer, they laughed off our efforts to cut or pry. A digital forensic specialist hooked into an external network port, attempting to brute force the system, to find a back door or a forgotten password. Lines of code scrolled across his laptop screen, a blur of green against black, but the house's firewall held firm, spitting back every probe with contemptuous ease. Thorne had spared no expense. And yet, someone had found a way past it. The sheer impermeability of the system, even to a highly skilled team employing every known method, wasn't just a failure on our part. It was a revelation about the killer. "Nothing," the lead forensic technologist reported on the evening of the second day, her voice flat with a hint of professional frustration. "No physical breach, no network exploit, no back doors we can find. It's like the house itself is a solid block of code and steel. Every method we know, the quiet hum of its systems, the subtle glow of indicator lights. It felt almost mocking. The implication was stark, chilling. They hadn't forced their way in. They had known their way in. They had exploited an obscure vulnerability, a digital whisper that only someone with deep insider knowledge could possibly have perceived. The how wasn't about breaking in. It was about access. That thought led me away from the physical structure and deeper into Thorne's digital footprint. If the entry wasn't physical, it had to be digital, but not in any way we could detect from the outside. It meant looking at Thorne's own data, the architecture of his digital life. My next stop was an underground facility, a secure server farm Thorne had built to house his most sensitive projects and personal data. The constant low hum of the cooling systems was a pervasive drone, a mechanical heartbeat to this digital brain. A data security specialist, his fingers flying across a keyboard, pulled up Thorne's network logs. He compartmentalized everything, the specialist explained, gesturing at a complex web diagram on his screen. Multiple layers of encryption, separate networks for different projects. Even his personal communications were routed through a private, proprietary VPN. We spent hours sifting through terabytes of data, looking for anomalies. A phantom login, an unauthorized access attempt, however fleeting. A data transfer that shouldn't have happened. Nothing, he finally declared, pushing away from the console with a sigh of defeat. No external breaches, no internal compromises we can detect. It's too clean. Too clean. The words echoed the frustration from the smart home. The killer hadn't just exploited a vulnerability. They had erased their tracks with a precision that bordered on the impossible. They hadn't left a single digital fingerprint, not even a smudged one. The mystery deepened, twisting into something far more intricate than a simple locked room puzzle. We weren't just hunting a killer. We were chasing a ghost, a phantom who moved through Thorne's highly fortified digital and physical worlds with an unseen key. The conventional tools, the conventional thinking, they were failing us. The absence gnawed at me. Not just the physical absence of a forced entry at the smart home, but the digital void, the meticulously scrubbed trails left behind by the killer. It felt less like a clumsy cover-up and more like an intentional statement, a deliberate artistic choice in the canvas of a crime. My mind kept circling back to the victim's digital footprint, or rather, the lack of one where it should have been deeply etched. The smart home's central server logs were pristine, almost clinically so, for the hours leading up to the mogul's death. Too clean, I'd thought, and the words still echoed, a persistent, irritating hum in my skull. That hum led me to the facility that housed the mogul's off-site data archives, a private fortress of information hidden beneath a nondescript corporate building. I navigated the maze of corridors, the air growing progressively colder and drier with each turn until I reached the core. A low, pervasive thrum vibrated through the floor, a symphony of 1,000 processors working in unison. The air, crisp and sterile, carried the faint metallic scent of ozone. Indicators on the server fronts blinked in erratic, rhythmic pulses. Amber, green, blue, a silent language of data flowing and storing. This wasn't just a storage facility. It was the digital heart of an empire, and somewhere within its vast network, I was convinced, lay the key to understanding the killer's methodology. I settled in front of a terminal, the screen a stark white canvas against the dim glow of the server lights. A technician, a quiet individual whose presence was as unobtrusive as the background hum, had set up access to the mogul's archived financial records, communication logs, and the intricate self-auditing reports from his personal network. My fingers danced across the keyboard, sifting through terabytes of information, not looking for what was there, but for what wasn't. Most of it was exactly as expected. Routine backups, automated system checks, the mundane digital heartbeat of a high-tech life. But then, I found it. They weren't errors in the conventional sense. They were too precise, too uniform in their randomness. Each discrepancy was small enough to be dismissed as a transient network glitch, a micro hiccup in the vast digital flow. But collectively, they formed a pattern, a meticulous, almost artistic pattern of fabrication. It wasn't just data deletion. It was data sculpting. The killer hadn't merely erased their tracks. They had carefully chiseled away specific pieces of information, not to hide a breach, but to construct the illusion of a system operating normally, albeit with minor, statistically insignificant anomalies. These weren't the digital fingerprints of a hacker trying to break in. They were the calculated strokes of someone trying to make it look like nothing had happened. Or rather, that what had happened was entirely self-inflicted. The too clean wasn't about the absence of a breach. It was about the engineered absence of evidence that would point to a breach. This was a level of sophistication that went far beyond mere tech savvy. This killer understood not just how to manipulate digital systems, but how forensic investigators think. They knew what we would look for, what patterns we would expect, and they had carefully ensured those patterns were either eradicated or subtly altered to tell a false story. This wasn't an ordinary murderer. This was someone who possessed an intimate, professional knowledge of forensic science. Someone who could anticipate my every move, every analytical step. The subtle alterations in the logs were designed to withstand initial scrutiny, to blend in with the background noise of system operations. Only a deep, almost obsessive dive, a search for the unnatural absence, could unearth them. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a simple game of cat and mouse. It was a psychological chess match, played out on the intricate board of forensic evidence. The killer wasn't just technologically brilliant. They were a forensic counter-expert, turning the very tools of my trade against me. It wasn't just about who had the technical prowess to bypass a smart home. This wasn't a hunt for a killer. It was a duel of intellects, a race against a mind that seemed to be several steps ahead, leveraging my own discipline against me. This killer wasn't just cunning. They were a ghost, moving through the evidence itself, leaving behind only the carefully constructed illusion of nothingness. The focus of my investigation shifted fundamentally in that cold, humming data center. It was about who possessed the profound understanding of forensic science, the chilling foresight to manipulate not just the crime scene, but the very evidence I would later uncover. My thoughts, a whirlwind of fragmented data points and digital footprints, coalesced around one central question. How deep did this manipulation go? Rows of racks stretched into the distance, each an intricate lattice of wires and circuit boards, a digital labyrinth. The low thrum of the machines was a constant companion, a white noise against the sharp click of my stylus on the tablet as I scrolled through encrypted logs. I was searching for the ghost in the machine, the subtle signature of a mind that understood both silicon and cadaver. The lead technician, a young woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper intellect, stood beside me, her breath misting slightly in the Arctic air. She pointed to a line of code, a particularly elegant piece of obfuscation. This is what I meant, Reed. It's not just a hack. It's surgical. Every access point, every timestamp, every log entry was either erased, overwritten, or subtly altered to point in a different direction. It's designed to look like routine system maintenance, or even a system glitch, rather than malicious intrusion. I leaned closer, my gaze tracing the digital breadcrumbs. He was right. The system log suggested a power fluctuation, an external event that could account for the brief offline status of the smart home's critical systems. But my own examination of the physical hardware in Thorne's home had revealed no such anomalies. The power grid was stable. The internal backups were clean. This digital chaos was engineered. Look at this timestamp, I instructed, tapping the screen. It's off by 17 minutes exactly. Not a rounded number, not an arbitrary interval. 17. And this specific method of cache flushing, it's a rarely used, almost archaic protocol deliberately invoked to appear as a system error. The technician frowned, her brow furrowing in concentration. You're right. Most contemporary systems wouldn't even default to that. It's like someone specifically programmed it to fail in an old-fashioned way. That word, old-fashioned, lodged itself in my mind. It wasn't a modern brute force attack. It was precise, almost nostalgic in its methodology, yet executed with cutting-edge tools. I zoomed in on the specific code sequence for the cache flush. There was a unique identifier embedded within it, a string of characters that, to the untrained eye, would look like random hexadecimal. But to me, it was a sudden, jarring chord in a familiar symphony. My breath hitched. My fingers, usually so steady, trembled slightly as I navigated through archived forensic reports on my tablet. This string. I'd seen it before. Not recently, not in any active case. It was from a file buried deep in my professional memory, an unsolved puzzle that had haunted me for years. The image of a dusty case file, its edges worn thin, flashed behind my eyes. The Bellwether Incident. That's what the press had called it. A decade ago, a brilliant, reclusive software architect had been found dead in his heavily secured rural compound. Suicide, the initial ruling had declared. But my peripheral involvement, A consultation on the digital forensics had raised alarms. The same meticulous digital camouflage, the same deliberately misleading system logs, the same utterly unique 17-minute timestamp discrepancy, and that peculiar, almost signature cache-flushing protocol, complete with the embedded identifier. It wasn't just a similar technique, it was the exact same handwriting. The killer hadn't just replicated the methods, they had perfected them. The Bellwether incident had been written off as a tragic but self-inflicted end, a genius succumbing to his own demons. My objections, my detailed notes on the digital anomalies, had been politely acknowledged and then ultimately dismissed by the lead investigator as mere speculation. The system, as it often did, preferred the path of least resistance. Now that same ghost had resurfaced, leaving an identical forensic fingerprint on Thorne's murder. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a pattern. This was a killer with a history, unpunished and unaddressed, who had been honing their craft for years. And I had been there, 10 years ago, an ignored voice in the wilderness, seeing the first iteration of this elaborate deception. This wasn't just another case anymore. This was personal. Someone had gotten away with it once, right under my nose, and they were back. The stakes had just escalated beyond a mere investigation into a wealthy tech mogul's demise. The air, conditioned to a frigid efficiency, bit at my exposed skin, but I barely registered it. Rows of rack-mounted servers, their status lights a constellation of green and amber, stretched into the sterile distance. This wasn't just a place for data. It was a vault, and someone had breached it with surgical precision. My fingers flew across the holographic interface projected from my portable analysis rig. The unique identifier, that cryptic string, was my anchor. I cross-referenced it against known malware databases, against open-source exploits, against every recorded digital footprint I could access. Nothing. It wasn't a public tool. It was bespoke. That made it more dangerous, more personal. I thought back to the initial scene, to the subtle inconsistencies Thorne's home had presented, the seemingly random glitches, the minor disruptions. They weren't chaos. They were camouflage. The killer hadn't tried to erase their tracks entirely, but to muddy the waters, to create enough digital noise to drown out the specific signal I was now chasing. This wasn't just technical expertise. It was an understanding of forensic methodology, of how investigators would try to piece together a digital crime. They knew how to misdirect. My gaze drifted to a small, almost imperceptible smudge on the side of one of the server racks, just above a patch panel. I'd noticed it earlier, a faint iridescent sheen that hadn't quite registered as anything significant amidst the sterile environment. Now, with the old-fashioned methodology in mind, and the killer's apparent forensic savvy, it suddenly screamed for attention. I pulled a micro swab from my kit and carefully collected a sample. Back at my mobile lab setup, a quick spectrographic analysis revealed a specific, rare chemical compound. It was a trace element, often used in highly specialized soldering applications for bespoke microelectronics, particularly those designed for extreme temperature fluctuations or signal shielding. Not something you'd find on standard commercial-grade hardware. My mind raced, connecting the bespoke code signature to the rare chemical compound. Someone had built a specialized device, likely for the sole purpose of executing this specific targeted attack. The behavioral pattern in the digital obfuscation began to coalesce. The way the data was fragmented, the false leads planted, the subtle delays in the system's response. It wasn't amateur hour. It was a master playing a game. They weren't just covering their tracks. They were setting traps, daring me to follow. Every red herring was placed with a deliberate hand. Every corrupted log file a calculated diversion. This wasn't just about breaking into Thorne's system. It was about controlling the narrative of his death, even after the fact. It spoke of meticulous planning, a deep understanding of system vulnerabilities, and an even deeper understanding of human psychology, specifically the psychology of forensic investigation. I pulled up Thorne's professional network, cross-referencing individuals with backgrounds in both advanced digital security and, more critically, those who had published or lectured on forensic countermeasures or digital obfuscation. The list was surprisingly short, but one name pulsed brighter than the others. A former protege of Thorne's, a brilliant but notoriously volatile programmer who had been instrumental in developing some of Thorne's earliest, most secure blockchain protocols. The protege had later split from Thorne, a public and acrimonious parting over intellectual property rights. The individual had then carved out a niche in high-end, bespoke digital security solutions, often working on projects that required extreme discretion and an almost paranoid level of data protection. They had even authored a controversial paper on untraceable digital footprints, a treatise on how to commit a digital crime without leaving a discernible trail for even the most advanced forensic teams. The paper had been widely dismissed as theoretical, but now it felt like a manifesto, the unique identifier in the cache flush code, the rare chemical compound on the server rack, the sophisticated, almost taunting pattern of digital obfuscation. The perpetrator wasn't just a tech expert, they were a forensic architect. They knew how I worked, what I would look for, and had meticulously laid their traps. My jaw tightened. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a direct challenge. A game of wits orchestrated by someone who understood the rules of engagement just as well as I did, if not better. I had a name, or at least a profile so specific it might as well have been a name. And they knew I was coming. But I'd seen enough digital detritus to know that true randomness was rare in human-generated data. This wasn't a system error. This was a signature. My fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing the identifier against known malware, historical exploits, even obscure open-source projects. Nothing. It was bespoke. Yet the structure, the particular way the bits were arranged, reminded me of something. A specific, antiquated cryptographic handshake protocol, one that hadn't been in widespread use for decades, often relegated to niche, highly specialized legacy systems. Why would a tech mogul with bleeding-edge security run such an anachronism? Unless he didn't. Unless it was planted. A cold certainty settled in my gut. This wasn't just about covering tracks. It was about laying new ones. The killer wasn't just erasing their presence. They were actively constructing a false narrative. A red herring designed to lead investigators down a very specific, very wrong path. They weren't hiding. They were playing. I leaned back, the hum of my workstation the only sound in the quiet space. The implications were chilling. If this was a game, then the killer understood the psychology of investigation, the tendency to follow the most obvious, albeit manipulated trail. They knew I'd find this identifier. They wanted me to find it. But why? I pulled up the victim's digital footprint again, focusing on any legacy systems, any obscure investments, anything that might link to this specific, outdated protocol. It was a long shot, but the killer had been meticulous. They wouldn't have used this signature without a purpose. After an hour of digging through financial records and archived patent applications, a name surfaced. A small, defunct data storage firm the mogul had acquired years ago, primarily for its real estate assets, leaving its older, less efficient infrastructure to slowly wind down. The address led me to an industrial park on the city's outskirts, a place I hadn't visited in years. It was a cavernous, nondescript building, the kind that blended into the urban sprawl easily overlooked. Inside, the air was dry and frigid, a stark contrast to the humid evening outside. I signed in with a security guard who barely looked up from his tablet, then followed the sparse lighting down a long corridor. These were the old guard, the silent sentinels of forgotten data, not the gleaming, high-speed arrays of a modern tech empire. I found the specific rack associated with the defunct firm, guided by a faded diagram I'd pulled from the mogul's archived digital files. The servers here were older, bulkier, designed for long-term, low-power storage rather than rapid processing. I scanned the physical connections, looking for anything out of place. Nothing obvious. But then I noticed a faint, almost invisible scratch on the dust cover of one particular server, just above a rarely accessed auxiliary port. My internal alarm bells screamed. This wasn't about the contents of these servers. It was about access. The unique identifier, the antiquated protocol. It wasn't just a signature, it was a key. A key to a system designed to be secure through obscurity. A system the killer knew Reed Kincaid would eventually trace back here. I connected my forensic toolkit, initiating a deep scan of the server's logs, bypassing the primary interface and going directly to the raw data streams. The process was slow, the old hardware grinding away. What I found confirmed my suspicions. A series of access attempts, not recent, but several weeks prior to the mogul's death, using the very protocol I'd identified. And more damning, a brief encrypted data transfer. The destination IP address wasn't local. It was an offshore server, registered to a shell corporation, but the pattern of data transfer, the specific packet sizes, matched another, more public financial transaction linked to a junior executive at the mogul's company. A rising star named Marcus Thorne. Thorne. Young, ambitious, with a clean record and a reputation for brilliance. The perfect patsy. The killer wasn't just misdirecting. They were actively building a case against an innocent man, using the mogul's own legacy infrastructure against him. The old-fashioned methodology wasn't just about the code. It was about the psychology of the frame, leveraging an obscure weakness in a system to create an airtight yet entirely false narrative. The cash flush, the identifier, the offshore transfer, it all pointed to Thorne, making it look like he'd been siphoning funds, then murdered the mogul to cover his tracks. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The killer was using the mogul's death as a smokescreen, not just to escape justice for this crime, but to orchestrate a far larger financial maneuver, perhaps even a hostile takeover, by eliminating the mogul and framing a key figure. This was a chess match, and I had just uncovered the opponent's next move. I couldn't alert Thorne directly. That would tip my hand, and the killer would simply pivot. I needed to let the trap be set, but with my own modifications. I downloaded the encrypted data transfer, then meticulously crafted a phantom access log, one that mimicked a genuine system audit, subtly altering the timestamps of the killer's initial access to make it appear as if the breach had been discovered after the mogul's death, not before. This wouldn't erase the evidence against Thorne, but it would inject enough doubt, enough procedural anomaly, to make any prosecuting body pause. It would buy Thorne time. It would buy me time. I wiped my digital footprint from the old server, leaving only my carefully planted digital breadcrumbs. The cold air of the data center felt heavier now, charged with the silent tension of an unseen battle. I was no longer just investigating a murder. I was playing a game of high-stakes deception, matching wits with a killer who thought several moves ahead. My counter-strategy was in motion. Now, I just had to wait for the killer to make their next move, confident they had woven their perfect web. But I knew better. I had just introduced a subtle, almost imperceptible flaw into their grand design. The cold hit me first, a sharp, clean bite that was more than just temperature. It was the chill of purpose, of machinery operating with relentless precision. Beyond the heavy, reinforced door, the air shimmered with the static hum of countless circuits. I stepped into the data center aisle-cold wallets and blinking servers, a labyrinth of metal and wire that stretched into the dim distance. Indicator lights, 1,000 tiny eyes, pulsed a silent, urgent language. The low, steady thrum of cooling fans was a hypnotic drone, a counterpoint to the rapid thudding of my own pulse. "Don't move." The lead detective's voice cut through the mechanical symphony, amplified by the confined space. Ahead, silhouetted against the emerald glow of a server rack, stood the system administrator. Their back was to us, shoulders tense, fingers hovering over a console that displayed a cascade of code. A half-eaten energy bar lay discarded on a nearby workstation, a mundane detail that felt grotesquely out of place in this high-stakes tableau. The air was thick with ozone and the scent of heated electronics. My gaze swept past the administrator to the screen, catching glimpses of file paths, deletion commands, a desperate last-ditch effort to erase their digital ghost. "It's over," I stated, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I moved slowly, deliberately, allowing the detective and a uniformed officer to fan out behind me. There's nowhere to hide, not here, not from what we know. The administrator finally turned, their face a mask of carefully constructed indifference. Their eyes, darting from me to the officers, betrayed a flicker of panic. Hide? I'm just doing my job, Reed. Routine maintenance. You're making a mistake. Their voice was calm, almost patronizing, the same dismissive tone I'd encountered when I first questioned Thorne's suicide. They had always been quick to explain away any anomaly, always had an answer ready, a narrative of convenience. Routine maintenance doesn't involve wiping critical system logs related to Thorne's access, I countered, my eyes fixed on the console. The deletion progress bar was still moving, agonizingly slow, or attempting to scrub the smart home's event history from this very server. Circumstantial, they scoffed, a tight, humorless smile playing on their lips. Anyone could have accessed those. This entire facility is designed for remote management. You're grasping at straws, Kincaid, looking for a culprit where there's only an unfortunate accident. The system administrator, brilliant and arrogant, believed their knowledge of the network and forensic obfuscation was impenetrable. They had relied on the initial suicide ruling, counting on the system's inertia. I began, my voice gaining momentum, each word a hammer blow. The same gloves you wore when you moved Thorne's body to stage the scene. Wiping down surfaces with the cleaning agent you knew would degrade quickly, leaving no obvious residue. The administrator's casual demeanor faltered. Their eyes flickered to their own gloved hands, then back to me. Those gloves are standard issue, and the cleaning agent. I often use it here. Not on Thorne's personal devices, you don't, I pressed, stepping closer, ignoring the subtle warning glance from the lead detective. We found residue of that specific agent on the underside of Thorne's smartwatch. A place you would have touched when you manually adjusted his vital signs to appear consistent with a sudden cardiac event, after you'd already delivered the fatal blow. A blow that, by the way, left a unique pattern of bruising consistent with a specific type of high-density Ethernet cable, the kind found coiled neatly in your personal server rack just a few feet from where you're standing. Their face was starting to pale, the indifferent mask cracking. You're fabricating this. It's ridiculous. Is it? I paused, letting the weight of my words hang in the air, punctuated by the rhythmic thrum of the servers. Let's talk about the digital footprints. You were meticulous. You disabled the internal cameras, spoofed the external ones, and even manipulated Thorne's biometric access logs to show him entering his home minutes before his death, when he was already incapacitated. A masterful performance designed to create an alibi, a ghost in the machine. I pulled a small sealed evidence bag from my jacket pocket. Inside, a tiny, almost invisible fiber, no larger than a speck of dust, glowed faintly under the miniature UV light I held next to it. This fiber, from your jacket, was caught in the smart lock mechanism of Thorne's front door. Not when you entered legitimately, but when you tampered with it, overriding the system to create the locked from the inside illusion. It's an anomaly, a microscopic oversight in an otherwise flawless plan. The administrator's eyes widened, tracking the fiber. It was the moment, the reveal. They had been so focused on the digital, on the macro, they had overlooked the micro, the physical trace left behind. Their breath hitched. You also overlooked the subtle shift in the network traffic patterns, I continued, pressing the advantage. A brief anomalous spike originating from a specific IP address within this very data center, connecting to Thorne's home automation system precisely at the moment of the staged suicide. An IP address registered to your workstation right here. I gestured to the console where the deletion progress bar had frozen, stuck at 98%. The system logs you're trying to erase now? We already have encrypted backups. Your attempts to delete them were logged too. Every keystroke, every command. Their eyes darted to the screen, then to my face. a desperate, cornered look replacing the arrogance. The perfect facade crumbled. The system administrator, once so confident in their digital mastery, now stood exposed, not by a grand, sweeping gesture, but by a collection of meticulously gathered truths. Growing louder, signaling the end. You. A raw edge of disbelief and defeat? No one could have found all that. I did, I replied, a quiet satisfaction settling over me. Because the dead always tell the truth, if you know how to listen. The lead detective stepped forward, hand on their sidearm. It's over. You're under arrest. As the uniformed officer moved in to secure the administrator, their gaze met mine one last time. There was no anger, no fight left. The silence that followed the uniformed officer's movement was heavy, broken only by the distant wail of sirens growing louder. The administrator, now secured, offered no resistance, their shoulders slumping as if a great weight had been lifted, or perhaps finally settled. That final hollow gaze they'd given me lingered, a testament to a mind that had spun an intricate web of digital deception, only to be caught by the smallest, most overlooked thread. My own breath hitched, a faint tremor running through me. It wasn't relief, not entirely. The subsequent weeks blurred into a whirlwind of affidavits, evidence presentations, and the methodical dismantling of a digital fortress. The district attorney's office, initially skeptical, now moved with a determined efficiency, armed with the undeniable proof my team and I had painstakingly unearthed. They had not physically touched Thorne. Instead, they had orchestrated his demise through a meticulously crafted sequence of digital commands, leveraging the very smart home system Thorne had so proudly designed. The administrator, driven by a blend of resentment and a desire to seize control of Thorne's vast digital empire, had spent months embedding hidden protocols within the smart home's core programming. The suicide was a masterclass in remote execution. A pre-programmed system override that, at a precise moment, had initiated a cascade of events. The environmental controls had been subtly altered, creating a physiological stressor. The locked doors and sealed windows were not to keep others out, but to ensure Thorne remained trapped within the meticulously controlled death chamber. Even the timing of the discovery had been factored in, designed to maximize the appearance of self-inflicted harm and minimize suspicion. The small, almost invisible details I'd found, the specific temperature fluctuations, the minute variations in air pressure, the subtle anomalies in the smart speaker's activity log, were all digital breadcrumbs leading back to the administrator's careful hand. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. News cycles were dominated by the story, and the legal system, once resistant to my unorthodox methods, now lauded them. My detailed reports, once met with furrowed brows, were now cited as crucial to cracking an impossible case. There was an acknowledgement, unspoken but palpable, that the landscape of crime had shifted, and with it, the demands on forensic science. The air was cool, smelling faintly of ozone and metal. This was the true crime scene, I realized, not Thorne's immaculate home, but this unseen web of data and algorithms. The administrator's brilliance was undeniable, a terrifying testament to what a keen mind, unmoored from ethical constraints, could achieve. They had understood the system better than its creator, exploiting every vulnerability, turning Thorne's sanctuary into his tomb. It was a profound and deeply unsettling thought. The weapon was not a gun or a knife, but lines of code, executed with surgical precision. My reputation was solidified, yes. The accolades came, the calls for consultation from across the globe. But the satisfaction was tempered by a deeper, more somber understanding. This case wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about peering into the future of crime. The tools of our trade, the scalpels, the microscopes, the chemical reagents, felt almost archaic against the invisible, intangible nature of this new threat. We were no longer just examining tissue and bone, but parsing digital footprints, interpreting the language of machines. The same technology that promised connection, convenience, and progress could, in the wrong hands, become an instrument of unparalleled depravity. My methods, once viewed as obsessive, were now seen as prescient. But I knew this was just the beginning. As technology advanced, so too would the cunning of those who sought to exploit it for malevolent ends. The challenge was immense, ever-evolving, and as I stood amidst the silent, blinking sentinels of the data center, I felt a familiar determination harden within me, tempered now with a quiet vigilance. The hunt for truth, it seemed, had just entered a new, far more complex era.